I'm sorry. Look, I'm pleased to be able to take a call on the Motor Vehicle Sales Amendment Bill and join with other colleagues in acknowledging the presence of the new Minister in the chair. I've been waiting for the new Minister perhaps to stand up and tell us what his first car was. Perhaps someone cruelly suggested it was a Lamington 3000. I don't know if that's true or not, but it would be interesting to hear from the Minister on that. And I also do want to acknowledge my colleague in the Wellington Central area, Heather Roy, the former Minister of Consumer Affairs, and I know that she took that job particularly seriously as a minister, and in the area of motor vehicle sales, where a lot of consumers perhaps are making one of their larger purchases. I know that she took her responsibility seriously, and it's very good to see her back in the House today. Mr Chair, I want to focus my contribution today around a couple of sections, my first contribution today, around a couple of sections in this bill, in particular the section around the requirements or the new requirements for people to notify the registrar if a new person becomes involved in the management of a company that is selling motor vehicles. And obviously this is something perhaps actually on reflection the new Minister might be interested in another part of his life, because this is a requirement if a person becomes concerned in the management of a company, or a new person becomes concerned in the management of a company, and the Minister himself has just recently become concerned in the management of an organisation, and I'm not sure if he's notified all of the appropriate people about that, but if he were a motor vehicle trader, or as it's actually extended to, and here a licensed car wrecker. And there perhaps could be some people who would suggest that Mr Boscawen's been involved in the wrecking and dismantling of something this week, if not a motor vehicle itself, Mr Chair. But yes, Section 12 actually does require all people who are doing this to notify their change of arrangements. And I know Mr Chair will have to indulge me a little on this, but it is relevant. The purchase of my second car that I owned had some relevance to the section, because I purchased what was a particularly poorly running Nissan Sunny station wagon. It was about this is about 20 years ago. I know that the Honourable Judith Collins was somewhat alarmed to learn that she'd been driving for 5 years longer than Mr Hipkins had been alive. So that's probably alarming for all of us, actually, but particularly. Well, right, so you were legal when you were driving. Yes, excellent. No, that's important to know. But when I purchased my second car, there was a Nissan Sunny station wagon, and I purchased it off a used car salesman in Invercargill. And that probably should have been my first warning, Mr Speaker, Mr Chair, that I was both in Invercargill and in the presence of a used car salesman. Not that I'm making any reflection on Invercargill.
Caution the member to be relevant to the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. So I was in Invercargill purchasing this car, and it was from a friend of mine. A friend of mine's father who was involved in this firm, and there was some time elapsed. I was having to drive from Dunedin to Invercargill with friends and to purchase this car. But when I finally did get around to purchasing the car, the ownership of the dealership had changed, and it was no longer my friend's father who was involved. And it would be fair to say, as I drove back from Invercargill to Dunedin, and the Chair may be familiar with part of the road I'm talking about here, is there are some quite good straight stretches as you leave Invercargill. I noticed the car had a distinct wobble, and somewhere I think I almost made it to Clinton, in fact, Mr Chair, which you'll know well, before we discovered that the cross member was completely rusted all the way through, and it did cause me a bit of drama. And I think had this clause been in place at that time, the new clause, Section 40A under Clause 12, I would have at least been able to have known that there had been some changes in the ownership of the company. And I do think this is important, Mr Chair, because as we all know, used car sales folk rank somewhere around where we do in terms of trustworthiness. I think in the last survey we were still as politicians, we were still beating used car sales people. Prostitutes had moved above us, I think, in the last survey in terms of being trusted professions. But I think it is important to be, well, that's right, it is legal. You seem well informed on that subject, Mr Hipkins. But it is important now that we have, within this Act, this Amendment Act, the new obligations on people to register a change in ownership, because like all professions, the motor vehicle sales profession needs to be able to, Mr Chair.
Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. I see you're wary about it, but I'll try and make it good. It is important that the motor vehicle sales industry improves its credibility and its performance, because cars are a very important part of people's purchasing lives, and anything we can do in this bill, and we are doing some good things in this bill to improve that, is great. So that section, the new Section 12, new Section 40A, requires people to notify the registrar if a new person becomes concerned in the management of that company. And in fact, later on in Section 14 of the amendment bill, it actually becomes an offence to fail to notify the registrar of a change that will actually see the person banned from trading motor vehicles. And that's in fact a very strong punishment, and a very good one, because it means that this is actually an effective tool. People will want to register the changes if they want to carry on being a motor vehicle salesperson. So, Mr Chair, I do believe that that's a very useful advance in this particular bill. I just want to also refer back to the process for renewing annual registration. So that's the new Section 9 of the bill. And again, this is a balance, as it is in all consumer legislation, between compliance and the rights and needs of the consumer. And I'm sure Mr Boscawen will, as he moves through his time as the Minister of Consumer Affairs, sadly for him, it will be ending next year when the government changes. But the process that he'll go through over the next 18 months, I think it's important that the balance is right. And here in this bill, we are making certain new obligations on motor vehicle salespeople, in particular making sure that they register, that they notify any change in the ownership of the company, and that there are now penalties in place for that. And I think that can only be good for the consumer. As earlier colleagues have mentioned, a lot of people purchasing cars are required by most people in their daily lives, and it means that a lot of the people purchasing cars are not perhaps familiar with all aspects of consumer law, and therefore we do need tight protections in this particular area of consumer law. I mean, someone like Mr Hipkins, who's purchasing a car when he was about 12 years old, by the sounds of it. 15 years old, so that was last year. He was obviously somebody like a lot of people who would be in need of greater consumer protection. A young person purchasing what for them is perhaps their major asset at that time. They need the improved and enhanced rules around motor vehicle sales that we see in the bill in front of us today. There is, of course, within this bill the ability for the registrar to cancel registrations of motor vehicle salespeople if they're satisfied that the company is one that they shouldn't be working with, or people shouldn't be buying cars from. And then, as is good in any piece of consumer legislation, there is another stage in it for perhaps the motor vehicle salesperson themselves, if they feel they've been hard done by. That route in this bill is the disputes tribunal, and clearly it's important for that to be covered, and I see that the committee in its process of working through the bill made some changes around this area, and perhaps a member of the committee or the Minister might like to be able to clarify what those were. But essentially the disputes tribunal does have jurisdiction over this. It's important that there is a place where any dispute around these matters can be resolved. As motor vehicle salespeople do have a fairly bad name in the community, it is possible that they would want the ability to be able to show to people that they have been unfairly dealt with, and the further sections 16 and 17 and so on go through and make clear where it is that people have to go if they're dealing with a disputes tribunal, what the fines are, and where the process will lead them. So, Mr Chair, I think the bill in general, and Part 1 in particular, contains some very good things. I'm pleased that Mr Boscawen is here. Most vehicles I know of have 4 wheels. 5 wheels is perhaps the preferred option for Mr Boscawen and his party, although it was touch and go this week whether it was going to be 5 or 4 wheels, but it seems that the spare wheel is back, and hopefully it'll be able to be used frequently, because I think most of us who've driven cars over a period of time know that the spare wheel can sometimes be the most important wheel on a car.